Okay, so this is intended as an introduction to Act 3, Scenes 1 and 2, which I want you to work on over the Christmas holidays. Now, as you're reading, I'd like you to make sure that you fill in a Cornell note-taking sheet, which you can see here on the screen. So you need your title at the top. About 3/4 of your page needs to be for your main notes, that's step 1. The margin on the left of your page is step 2. So after you've listened to the video, go through and extract your keywords, any questions that you have. And then maybe the next day, I want you to do step 3, which is after watching the video, use your keywords to write a summary about the topic. Okay, so hopefully doing those 3 steps will help to really consolidate your learning and move it into your long-term memory. So where are we in the play so far? Well, you should be familiar with Freytag's pyramid, which is the structure that we use to show the progression of the plot. So generally we start with the exposition, and in Othello this establishes his nobility against a background of xenophobia or racism. So at this point of the play, Iago and Rodrigo waken Brabantio, telling him that Othello and Desdemona have eloped, and you'll remember that from Act 1, Scene 1. And of course, Iago's language in that scene is highly racist, and Rodrigo follows him in that. After that, we see Iago manipulating Rodrigo, telling him to put money in his purse and so on, and get ready to make sure that they cause Othello's downfall. The next scene, Act 1, Scene 3, is where, Act 1, Scene 2, is where Iago presents an honest face to Othello, who's then called before the Duke to lead the Venetian force against Cyprus. And so Brabantio is then forced to accept the marriage. Now, towards the end of Act 1, Desdemona appears on stage and she is presented as being very determined and self-possessed, and she wants to go to Cyprus as well. So essentially she is asking to take part in the conflict, which would be unusual for a woman at the time. And as we're going to see towards the middle of Act 3, she then changes quite dramatically as a character and becomes much more reserved, much more passive. So Act 2, the rising action. Now in Othello this reveals how one's insecurities can be exploited, destabilising the precarious balance of love, marriage and social order. So essentially Othello's marriage starts to become a little bit shaky, and then we see the ripples spreading out from that and affecting everyone else in society. For example, we've seen the fight scene happening in that act. So the storm is a symbol of chaos. It destroys the Turkish fleet. Desdemona, Emilia, Cassio and Iago then arrive on Cyprus, and they are waiting for Othello. There's a bit of a witty repartee between Iago and Desdemona as they wait. Now again here we see Desdemona as very confident, very self-possessed, and quite unusual, unstereotypical for a woman at the time. Othello then arrives and is absolutely overwhelmed by his love for Desdemona. After that, a feast is announced in Act 2, Scene 2, and it's to celebrate the victory against Turkey and also the marriage of Othello and Desdemona. And Shakespeare really marries those two ideas together to show the really close connection between conflict in the political world, but also the conflict that's going to come in the marriage later in the play. So Iago and Rodrigo conspire to make Cassio drunk, and then he fights Montano. Now, Othello's wedding night is interrupted and he starts to lose control over his emotions. This is the first time we see Othello's kind of veneer of calmness start to crack, and we might start to ask ourselves, actually maybe was Iago possibly a little bit accurate when he talks about Othello in Act 1, Scene 1? And then we can start to ask ourselves the question, is Shakespeare agreeing with Iago? Or does he want to continue to present Othello and therefore black people in general as being completely different from the stereotypes that Iago is projecting onto Othello? So after the fight, Othello has demoted Cassio, and Iago persuades Cassio to ask Desdemona to intercede with Othello. And then we get to this section here, so the start of Act 3. After that, we'll look at the climax later on in the year, the falling action, and then the denouement of the play. But we're interested in where this red arrow is right now. So, Act 3, Scene 1. What actually happens in it? Well, first of all, Cassio hires musicians to play for Othello and Desdemona, but Othello sends a client to pay them to stop. Now, this is interesting because it shows that Othello and Cassio aren't agreeing in this scene. Cassio's trying to do something that's quite nice, quite friendly for Othello, and Othello's rejecting that. So on one level, it could show the breakdown of the relationship between the two characters. However, on a different level, we might question why Othello doesn't like music. Does it mean that he's not a man of culture and therefore of the emotional sensitivity that's connected with that? Is this again suggesting that Othello might be a more violent and a less emotionally astute character than we perhaps thought when we first met him in Act 1? After that, the clown, who's normally a comic character in Renaissance plays, who voices deep truths and provides a satirical commentary on the main plot, so think about the porter in Macbeth, for example. So the clown puns on the word honest, and thus questioning the integrity of those on the island. The clown then departs to tell Emilia that Cassio is waiting, and Iago enters. Cassio laments his demotion to Iago and explains that he is going to ask Emilia for help with Desdemona. And here we see Iago's malign influence over the other characters expanding because he's drawing them in towards himself and earning their trust, essentially. Cassio and Iago have been quite separate at the start of the play. So, for example, Iago knows about the marriage between Othello and Desdemona, but Cassio doesn't know about it, which suggests that they don't socialise together, whereas here we see that Cassio is becoming much more close to Iago and much more dependent on him. So after that, Iago says that he will distract Othello. Cassio thanks him, saying, "I never knew a Florentine more kind and honest." Now, this is laced with irony. We could question perhaps the use of the word Florentine, because actually we know from Act 1, Scene 1 that Iago describes Cassio as the Florentine. Now, it could be that Shakespeare was writing the play so quickly that he forgot this detail and got the characters mixed up. Or it could be suggesting something a bit deeper, which is that Machiavelli, who wrote The Prince and where the adjective Machiavellian comes from, was actually from Florence. And so it's very ironic because Machiavelli really stands for deception, scheming, cunning, and earning political power through intelligence, i.e. what Iago was trying to do. Okay, so next point, Iago then leaves and Emilia enters immediately, telling Cassio that Desdemona is already speaking up for him with Othello. Emilia explains that Othello has refused so far because the man he injured is of great importance in Cyprus. However, Othello still admires Cassio, and so he will look for an opportunity to reinstate him. So Emilia is unwittingly here taking part in Iago's plan. Finally, in this scene, Cassio asks Emilia if he can speak to Desdemona alone, and Emilia agrees to help. So, zooming in on Cassio then, well, he's quite inexperienced in this scene and throughout the play, really. So in Act 1, Scene 1, Iago is very irritated that Cassio has been promoted, and Iago says that Cassio has never set a squadron in the field. He describes him pejoratively as a spinster. Then in Act 3, Scene 1, Cassio reveals that. He says to the musicians, "Masters, play here, I will content your pains." So he's going to pay the musicians for playing. Now, surely he should realise that after grossly offending Othello and interrupting his wedding night, that it's probably not a good idea to do the same thing again and interrupt Othello, who's in the bedroom with Desdemona. However, Cassio goes ahead with this, and then Othello sends out the clown to stop the music. Cassio is also presented as being very loyal to Othello right the way through the play. So in Act 3, Scene 1, he refers to him as being the general, which is in stark contrast to Iago and Rodrigo in Act 1, Scene 1, who we will remember talk about him as being the Moor and the Black Ram. Cassio is also naive and easily deceived, particularly by Iago. And again, we've got this quotation, "I never knew a Florentine more kind and honest," showing the depth of the deception that Iago is enacting upon Cassio. Next, Cassio is presented as being very admiring of Desdemona. Now, we've seen that before at the start of Act 2, where he calls her exquisite. He says that she is perfection itself. In 3.1, he refers to her as the general's wife, as the virtuous Desdemona. And of course, this contrasts really clearly with Iago, who has a very debased perception of femininity. And in 2.3, Iago refers to Desdemona as being sport for Jove, full of games, so reducing her really to a sexualized object. Looking at Iago then a bit more closely, in Act 3, Scene 1, he's very controlling, he's very dominant, although without appearing to be so. So essentially he's stage managing the scene, he is the puppet master, controlling the characters, whilst concealing his own reasons for doing so. So if we look back at Act 1, Scene 1, he talks about how he wants Rodrigo to poison Brabantio's delight and plague him with flies. And then in 3.1 he says, I'll send Emilia to you presently. So he seems to be in control of the characters around him who are duped as part of this plan. One of the interesting things about Iago is that he is very deceptive, but at the same time he's often very honest, and he does tell other characters what he's doing. However, they assume that that can't possibly be true, that it must be some kind of joke. In Act 2, Scene 3, Iago says, what's he that says I play the villain, when this advice I give is free and honest? And that is truthful in terms of Iago's character. He is often extremely honest. So he says to Cassio in Act 3, Scene 1, I'll devise a mean to draw the Moor out of the way, as in I'll create a plan, I'll create an opportunity to get the Moor out of the way, to get Othello out of the way while you talk to Desdemona. Now, he's basically telling Cassio here that he's going to deceive Othello, which is exactly what he's going to do. So again, he's being very, very honest and therefore quite deceptive in terms of his tactics at this point of the play. Iago, as we've seen before, is also inherently racist. So in Act 1, Scene 1, he refers to Othello using very animalistic language, talks about him making the beast with two backs. And then here in Act 3, Scene 1, he consistently refuses to use Othello's name and reduces him to really just a word referring to Othello's ethnicity, calling him the Moor. Okay, Emilia then. So Emilia is controlled and duped by Iago at this part of the play. She's quite keen to please him, even though in Act 2, Scene 1, she does seem to be quite annoyed and quite fractious when she's speaking to Iago. Iago says that her tongue is too sharp, that she's too insulting, and she replies to him, you have little cause to say so. And then they're talking with Desdemona about flattery and so on, and she says, you shall not write my praise, as in, I don't want you to flatter me. However, in 3.1, as soon as Iago exits, Emilia enters. So it seems that she's very keen to please Iago and to do what he tells her to do, and we'll see that later with the handkerchief as well. And in this way, at this point of the play, she's a character foil for the determined and independent Desdemona. So in 1.3, for example, we've seen that Desdemona has deceived her father and may deceive thee, whereas here we see Emilia, who doesn't deceive the men around her but follows what they tell her to do. Now that's going to reverse towards the end of Act 3 and certainly into Act 4, particularly in the Willow scene. Emilia will become very independent, very determined, and Desdemona will become the passive character who accepts the fate that's been given to her. So really here we see Shakespeare questioning the role of women in society, whether women have the strength to maintain independence in the face of rejection by the men around them, in the face of the continual objectification of the men around them. Okay, Emilia also echoes Iago's speech, which foreshadows something that Othello is going to do later in the play when he starts using Iago's words. So Emilia, like Iago, refers to Othello as being the Moor, for example. Emilia also seems a little bit deceptive in this scene, so she says, I will bestow you where you shall have time to speak your bosom freely. So essentially, I'll take you to a place where you can speak to Desdemona as much as you want and honestly. So again, she seems quite keen to deceive Othello at this point. Okay, Act 3, Scene 2 then, a very short section of the play. So we see Othello, he has prepared letters to the Senate in Venice, and he commands Iago to send these. Iago agrees. And Othello and the gentlemen then go on to examine the fortifications, the battlements on the island. So really, what is the function of this scene? It's so short, it seems a little bit unnecessary. Well, it's to present Othello as being very commanding and very dominant. So we've seen this before in Act 1, Scene 2, where Iago says that he wants to yerk Rodrigo in the ribs, and Othello says, no, 'tis better as it is, as in, calm down, I'm going to tell you what to do, Iago. And then here he uses imperative verbs again. These letters give, so that's our imperative, the give. These letters give Iago to the pilot. So maintaining his calm, composed exterior here and maintaining his position in charge of Cyprus. Overall then, what is the function of these scenes? Well, they present characters on the very brink of chaos. Act 3, Scene 1 oscillates between prose and blank verse. We know that for Shakespeare, normally prose is more associated with the chaos, with being kind of on the edges of society, and with psychological upset. So if you think about Lady Macbeth towards the end of Macbeth, or if you think about Iago at the very start of Othello, speaks in prose in the first scene, and in that quite chaotic speech where he tells Rodrigo to put money in thy purse, and he becomes quite angry, that's all in prose, whereas blank verse, iambic pentameter without a rhyme, is a very ordered, very controlled way of speaking. So in this scene there are also contrasting commands to the musicians. So there's a battle of power really, in a small way, between Cassio and Othello, which doesn't bode well for the future. There are deepening levels of deception as Iago gradually gains power over the other characters. As I said, consolidation of Iago's control. And the setting is also very symbolic. So we remember that Venice is a centre of cosmopolitanism and also of debauchery, so it's a Janus faced, a two-sided city. Cyprus is on the very edge of the known world at the time, and it would have been associated with chaos, with wilderness, with being at the frontiers of civilization, so close to the unknown realm outside of Central Europe. The other function of these scenes is to reinforce Othello's desire for control. So on the one hand, this continues to challenge the racist stereotypes of Jacobean Europe. So Othello is respected, he's admired by the gentlemen, he is portrayed as dedicated, successful leader, prepared to examine the fortifications even though it is the night after the celebration of his own wedding, and the threat of Turkish assault has already passed. So that seems pretty good really. On the other hand, his desire for control could be concerning, reminding the audience that he does not like to be challenged or disobeyed, and therefore foreshadowing some of the disagreements he will have with Desdemona later on in the play. So that's the end of Act 3, Scene 2. I hope now that you go and you read the scenes on your own, that you make sure you understand the different lines of it, and you come to the lesson prepared to discuss.